Nous formons la prochaine génération pour relever les défis stratégiques de demain. Nous sommes dédiés à comprendre pour mieux agir.
C'est le moment de vous présenter notre conférencier d'honneur, le lieutenant général Mike Rouleau, le vice-chef de l'état-major des Forces armées canadiennes. Un gros merci d'être avec nous pour notre premier colloque annuel du réseau sur l'ordre international fracturé. J'espère que vous vous êtes senti inspiré par notre thématique. You know perhaps better than anyone how the fractured international order impacts defense considerations for Canada. Before we launch off, I'll ask everyone listening to refer to General Rouleau's bio in the program. I would still like to highlight a few things. General Rouleau is the Vice Chief of the Defense Staff since last July, and prior to that, he was Commander of the Canadian Joint Operations Command. General Rouleau commanded Canada's Special Operations Forces Command from 2014 to 2018, but his service in Special Operations began in the mid-1990s with Joint Task Force 2 as a badged Special Operations Assaulter. As you'll see from his bio, General Rouleau has commanded at every level, including deployed task forces and teams in Afghanistan, the Balkans, and Africa. We have 30 minutes for the keynote speech today, followed by about 20 minutes of Q&A, which I'll be moderating. General Rouleau, thank you very much for accepting our invitation to deliver the keynote speech today. Merci de participer au colloque du réseau d'analyse stratégique. La parole est à vous. The floor is yours.
Merci beaucoup, Stéphanie, et bonjour tout le monde. Bon matin, mesdames et messieurs. Ça me fait plaisir d'être ici aujourd'hui pour parler un petit peu d'un sujet très important. Et puis, fait qu'au nom du général M.N, notre chef d'état-major de la Défense, je vous salue. I hope to maybe talk for 15 or 20 minutes. I find that the value of these things more often than not is tends to be in the Q&A space. I apologize for that, a little bit of feedback, but we're good. So let me just launch right in and hit across a range of issues that are apropos of the subject matter, but really focusing, I think, a little bit more on the institutional implications or so what's, because as the Vice Chief of the Defense Staff, you all know that I wear three hats. So I'm the second in command of the Armed Forces. I'm also the Chief of Staff to both the Deputy Minister and the Chief of the Defense Staff. And so the costs of NDHQ, if you will. And then finally, I'm the officer charged with executing the Defense Services Program, pushing the 24, gusting to $37 billion through the policy plan program budget continuum. And so it is from that perch that I kind of talk to you today. I think everything I say has to be sort of a pretext on the fact that we're in a pan-domain context. And so a couple of years ago in CJOC, we took to refreshing our view of the nature of conflict, and really, you might hear the term all domain, but we have come to a pan-domain force employment concept. And what that really supposes is that adversaries will work to induce friction across the air, maritime, land, space, cyber, and informational continuums, and they'll do this as simultaneously as possible to sort of saturate the environment with problems. And so what this means is that we need to have enhanced engagement. We're comfortable in air, land, and maritime, but more so refining our engagements in the space, cyberspace, and informational domains. And I would just point out that from my humble perch, I think the informational domain is in many ways the seminal one, where you can win in the future on the battlefield, or you can win in the future in competition. But if you lose the informational fight, you really haven't won anything at all. So we've moved beyond jointness to this pan-domain idea. And in that sense, integration is everything. And you'll hear me refer to this a couple of times during my talk, but I've really got two mantras as the Vice Chief. The first is discipline, and the second is integration. Any success in the future relies on integration. The space, cyber, and informational domains have really kind of radically changed the way we think about the borders. You know, when I joined the military back in the sort of mid-'80s, it was a very defined thing, military operations that happened within defined boundaries and all the rest of it, but that doesn't apply anymore. And so simple divisions based on land borders, or between domestic and expeditionary, or between physical and non-physical effects, I think is really the new reality that we face. And I think to some extent, our defense policy, strong, secure, and engaged, was an effort to sort of move into that reality and help us with some of the fixes. You know, I won't get into the details of it, but SSE puts a significant amount of attention to things like cyber and space. We are operating above and below the threshold today and moving forward. And so we view this in a compete, contest, confront, and where necessary, combat kind of sense. And so while the lines between peace and war have blurred, I would argue that where we are today, operating in the South China Sea, for example, you know, we're in a state of constant competition against certain adversaries. Where we operate in Latvia and Ukraine, we are constantly competing with the Russians in that sense. And so the lines have blurred, and I think we need to look at things much more holistically. I think everything that we do or don't do sends a message. And so our thinking around operations has to be much more nuanced and sophisticated than it has been in the past. So we need to come up with new paradigms to meet this new reality. And as I mentioned earlier, the pan-domain force employment concept was one such way of doing that. Increasingly, we need to be much more rigorous in the application of the military instrument of power. Part of that goes to oversight. You know, I wrote a master's thesis way back in like 2010 or 2011 before I commanded Special Forces. And the monograph was entitled Between Faith and Reality. And it was an examination of Canada Special Forces Command. And in that monograph, I wrote that CANSOF should get very comfortable with the idea of much more oversight, all the way up to and including more direct parliamentary oversight, because I could see that the future, you know, was moving in this direction. And not only is it not something we should fear as military professionals, rather it's something we should embrace, because of course our accountabilities, our authorities flow from Parliament to military commanders, and then our accountabilities necessarily flow back up. The future will also demand that we need more precision and more speed in the delivery of the military instrument of power. And so this goes to things like novel approaches that we need to consider. It goes to ensuring that our policy suites are, you know, enabling speed and precision and not hampering it. It goes to much more collaboration. You know, you can imagine that the amount of collaboration we have to do with, you know, foreign affairs partners in GAC around operations in the South China Sea is robust and should be robust, because there's obviously heavy diplomatic and economic and informational interests in what we do as well. And we are, of course, not expert in that domain. I think we need to be much more comfortable militarily with accepting failure. Not only accepting failure, but demanding failure, because we can't want to innovate moving forward if we're not prepared to fail. Integration and discipline I talked about, and I'll come back to those in a little bit. Transparency, and of course the allies are going to continue to be vital. And increasingly the work that we do overseas is largely by, with, and through partners, and not necessarily directly against an adversary. You know, having the ability to have access and influence into a region is the high watermark in many of these missions, as opposed to achieving a defined policy objective in itself. Defending the rules-based international order, I think, is something that we always have to keep foremost in our minds, and the operating environments that we are in are complex. And so decisions that young officers are making out there on their own, alone and unafraid in the middle of the night, have a direct bearing on this country's reputation. And we've got reams of depth at the tactical level. And this is one of the themes that I harp on as the Vice Chief. We need to orient our focus and our limited bandwidth to problems at the operational and strategic levels. And we should feel comfortable that we have a lot of depth at the tactical level to rely on. In Q&A, I can get into more of the operations that we do in Korea, or in support of UN Security Council resolutions against North Korea. I can talk about the South China Sea and the Taiwan Strait to some extent, but I won't take too much time to do that in my comments. What I will say, though, is that we are seeing instances where we're being actively interfered with by other states. And so examples could be our GPS being jammed in the EM spectrum by capable state actors. And why I say this is because, one, it underscores the fact that we are in fact competing, or in some cases sort of contesting for a particular piece of the ocean or whatnot. But it really goes to resilience. And this is a theme that I'm harping on as the Vice Chief, about increasing our resilience as a fighting force and ensuring we have modalities to fall back on when exquisite technologies are not available to us. A great example of that is, the wars we have fought since 9/11 have featured air dominance. Well, when we went to Iraq as special forces and started seeing small UAVs that were weaponized being flown against us, all of a sudden the air dominance piece was challenged, and we didn't necessarily have a ready answer for that. And so the future is about a combination of old and new technologies, old and new ways of thinking in order to succeed. And so moving on to the Arctic, I think we need to recognize in the armed forces that that's an area of significant strategic concern around the world, and one that obviously organizations like NATO are concerned with, and of course we own a big chunk of that. To that end, when you're talking about 7-9 million square kilometers of largely uninhabited landmass, it gives rise to the notion of surveillance and information awareness and whatnot. So we need to be thinking about our armed forces increasingly as a system of systems, et non seulement capacité X ou capacité Y qui peut survoler un area pendant 15 heures. On devrait penser plus de notre Force armée canadienne comme un portfolio de systèmes qui doit être connecté davantage par rapport à ce qu'on a vu dans le passé. And I think this is one area where we have some work to do, ensuring that we have the passage of data ability baked into our platforms that we're acquiring. So what I'm telling people is we need to focus much less on the platform itself that we're trying to acquire, and we need to ensure that we're buying the ecosystem around that platform to include IMIT, the passage of data, the digitization aspect of it, the correct infrastructure, the correct people that are trained on these new systems in time, the right doctrine adaptations to maximize these systems. And so we're taking a much more portfolio view. And this really talks about management and stewardship as opposed to direct command. And so what I'm saying to the general and the flag officers in the military is our role is to be excellent stewards and managers, and don't overlead the organization, but make sure you're managing it well. And so to me, that's real leadership, not just the facile notions of command and running around talking to the corporals kind of thing. We have relative areas of strength and weakness. I've talked about the tactical depth that we have, but my view of growth is about being better and better, not bigger and bigger. And I think that's one of the things that kind of ails us in our DNA, this notion that the answer to every new problem is more people and more money. I disagree with that at a very fundamental level. In fact, I think organizations that grow, when you get one person beyond X, you get worse as an organization with every person you add, not better. And so that's certainly the view I take as the Vice Chief of the Defense Staff. So we need to constantly challenge our structures, our methods, and see where we can kind of wire brush them internally. I've talked about the portfolio view. I can expand on that a little bit more in the Q&A as we see fit. Suffice it to say, data and digitization and the whole initiative around trying to move from being a largely analog CAF to one that is much more digitized is really predicated on two ideas. The first idea is that our allies are digitizing themselves and quickly, and our allies are using data increasingly and quickly. And so if we don't do the same, our very interoperability with key allies will be challenged. So that's incentive number one. Incentive number two is the adversary. And our adversaries are themselves modernizing their militaries. And I should think that any military who shows up on a modern kinetic battlefield in the future who is analog will be punished by militaries who are digitized. And I think recent events in Nagorno-Karabakh kind of speak to that. Any military that's going to show up and mass itself will be literally annihilated by a highly connected and digitized opponent. And so the data and digitization thing for me is job number one as the Vice Chief of the Defense Staff. Anything I can do to enable that, I see as my stock and trade. I issued 4 key capability priorities when I became the Vice Chief in July. Number 1 was data and digitization. Number 2 was C4I backbone. So we don't have a recognized, architected, coherent, and common command control communications and computer backbone to move data across. I can tell you that we need to fix that, and we are moving to fix that now. So that's priority number 2. Priority number 3 was sustain and supply chain. Our supply chain is very analog, and I watched as Commander Seajock in the height of wave 1 of the pandemic. I watched our military supply chain get pulled very tight. We need to fix that. And of course, the 4th priority is professional military education, the cognitive underpinning for all of this. So a few words on data and digitization, if I may. We need to see data in terms of being shared and accessible, understandable, trusted, and secure. More to the point, we need to see data as a commodity to be shared and leveraged, and not a resource to be hoarded. I think that, in as much as anything, is a cultural change. On the issue of culture, to digitize this force, to embrace data, I think our greatest weakness is our culture, because militaries tend to be conservative, very stratified, and command and control oriented for a lot of good reasons. So embracing something that has to horizontally integrate across the entire enterprise is a challenge. I think our greatest strength to achieve data and digitization, however, is our culture. No one can turn to a problem and solve it like military forces. And I think recent work by Danny Forte in the issue of vaccine distribution is a case in point. But here's the thing. We need to sort of approach this problem in a very coherent way. The Associate Deputy Minister and I are as one, moving in to help remedy this issue. We need to see opportunistically, we need to see places where we can make a big difference, but we cannot see this as just taking a black box and plopping it on top of what we do today at all. We need to fundamentally re-examine our internal processes with a view to then leveraging what the technology can give us. And in that way, we can revolutionize how we do and what we do. So it's the very kind of approach that we take that's going to dictate how successful we're going to be. Like project work itself, I keep telling people we need to be descriptive and not proscriptive in the language that we're using. You know, the language that's far too prescriptive is limiting language and doesn't allow for room to create. So I think we need just enough top-down direction and guidance to frame the ecosystem, but that leaves a lot of room for, if you will, this initiative to be crowdsourced, because the creativity and the expertise lives on the shop floor. So fundamentally, ladies and gentlemen, a lot of this is about alignment and convergence. I can talk a little bit about the supply chain. Suffice it to say, I'll give you the example of Mali. When I was the commander of Joint Ops Command and we went to Mali, we actually deployed 1 additional helicopter of each type because we didn't have confidence in our supply chain getting key parts to that part of the world. Now, yes, geography was part of that, but we had the air bridges in place. Fact of the matter is, because our supply chain was analog, we felt more confident that if we sent an additional machine forward, we'd be able to canalize it. So this speaks to how we need to automate, simplify, and integrate our supply chain. On professional military education, would just suggest that we need to increasingly ensure that we're selecting leaders who have obviously good IQ, but even better EQ. And I think emotional intelligence is one of the signature pieces that senior leaders need today to operate and be successful in the complex environment that we live in. But we also need leaders who are at some level comfortable in absorbing risk. You know, we do not live in a risk-free environment, and if you want to make progress and land things and be a finisher, you have to be comfortable with risk. So I think those things plus character to be able to speak truth to power indicate the kind of leaders that we need in the future. We need to push power to the edge. We need to, as a community in the military, empower the younger set and challenge them to get us to the right places, having framed the environment well enough. And I think the more that we can adopt that kind of approach, the more successful we're going to be in future conflict. Because back to my pan-domain realities, the ecosystem will be too flooded with friction to be able to call home and ask Ottawa what we should do. And so this goes to trust. And like Covey said, trust, if you have a normative level of it, it sort of increases the quality of the results. And I mean, I could go on at length for that, but I'm a big believer in power to the edge and speaking about trust being a normative reality between me and my subordinates as a start point. So I think this is maybe fertile ground for more in the Q&A. I would also like to talk quickly about creativity. I don't think there's enough of that in our system, and that we should demand more. Lord knows we have the right smart people out there. I just sometimes think that latent potential isn't fully harnessed. And so the idea that we need to embrace cognitive friction, indeed demand cognitive friction around the table. Friction produces better results. And in that sense, we need to not just grow, but nurture disruptive thinkers, so that we have all the viewpoints of an issue. And I try to do that in my own organizations, make sure that I'm celebrating the creative disruptor in the group who doesn't necessarily look like the rest of us or think like the rest of us, but who definitely makes the solutions much more powerful. So I think that's an important ingredient too. Diversity is not a bumper sticker. I would talk to the troops every time I went out there. I think diversity comes in many different forms, and I do think that the more diverse we are, the more powerful we are. And I often mentioned a story about two fellas named Mo and Saeed in JTF2 who were top secret interpreters for us, and how Mo and Saeed made us far more powerful tactically because of what they brought to the table from a cultural or linguistic or other perspective. Agility is going to matter in the future. Agility in the way we think, agility in the way we react to crises, agility in the way we procure systems. And we are on that path in the Vices group of challenging the status quo to make sure that we're fit for purpose and remaining compliant with the spirit and the written word of legislation or directives or whatnot. I often find that people are too quick to criticize other organizations. And what I keep saying is we have a lot of things we need to fix internally. And only once we've fixed every last one of them do we earn the right to editorialize on other organizations. And so that's the spirit that we're coming at this from. Ladies and gentlemen, I think I'll conclude my comments there. I look forward to the Q&A. I've put a few ideas on the table. And once again, Stephanie, I want to thank you for inviting me to say a few words on behalf of the Armed Forces here today. Merci.